Cool. So, hey everyone, and thanks for being here. So, this talk is about dark mode on the web. And of course, my slides have to fit the theme here, so let's just get started. So, my name is Tom, and I'm a web developer working at SciTech. I do front-end development mostly because I enjoy all things related to user experience and design and all that good stuff. So, this is also a front-end talk. And of course, I have to have a dark themed image here as well, so there you go. And during this talk, I will try to cover 3 topics. So first, I'll get into why themes are actually important, followed by what is needed from design, and then about half of this talk will be about what implementation could look like. But before I get into all of that, I want to quickly go over what I mean exactly with dark mode on the web. So as a short introduction, with dark mode, I'm talking about light-themed websites that should also offer a dark theme of their layout. But this also goes the other way around. So websites that already have a dark layout now should also consider offering a light theme of their layout. And in the front end, we can do that by using what is called prefers color scheme. So this is a CSS media feature that allows us to detect the theme of the user's operating system. And that can look like this. So this is some CSS code where we can check if the user's operating system is set to a dark theme. And we can decide to make the background color a dark gray, for example. But we can also detect if the user is using a light theme, in which case you could make the background color white. And prefers color scheme has excellent browser support, by the way. So i11, of course not. No surprise, nothing is happening there anyway. But all major browsers have been supporting this media feature for quite some time now, actually. So it's definitely ready to be used. So with that short introduction, let's get into why themes are actually important. So more and more applications are going along with the operating system theme, whether they're websites or native mobile applications on your phone. And the truth is, the longer you wait with implementing themes, the more you will be the odd one out, because people increasingly care about themes, and especially about dark themes in particular. And when you as a user are using websites and applications that all adjust properly, and suddenly there's this one application you switch to that doesn't, and suddenly like illuminates your room at night, it may not be the most pleasant experience. That can be exaggerated, of course, to a degree, but even though there's still nothing wrong with having a strong preference, for some people it is more than that, and it's actually a matter of accessibility. Because if you are in an environment with little light, then bright websites can be eye-straining to deal with, even on low screen brightness settings. And that can be especially troublesome for people prone to migraines, for example. But the opposite is true as well. So let's say you are in a bright environment, working outside in your garden or from your balcony, for example, then a dark website could also be eye-straining and potentially have the same effect there. So also don't forget that accessibility isn't just focused on, let's say, disabilities, but also very much related to practical use. And literally everyone will eventually benefit from having good accessibility. So knowing this, how do we get started? And ideally, you start with a good design foundation, which can be quite something depending on how serious you want to take it. So let's take a look then at a few things that we need from a design point of view. And the first thing is to have dark mode colors, because you simply cannot invert colors and be done with it. There's actually a lot to it if you want to convert a light theme to a dark theme or vice versa. So this is a simple example from material design, where besides the obvious theme, you can see some subtle differences between the 2 images. For example, the small cards on the left side are the same color as the background, right? So they're all white. But on the right side, you can see that the cards have a slightly different color of gray, creating this elevation effect. But also the top bar is now purple on the right, because that much purple on a dark background would just be too much. But they do keep the purple for the little graph in the bottom right corner, for example, as an accent or a theme color. So it's not just changing, for example, white colors to dark colors or the other way around. The colors do require some fine-tuning. And this picture, you can also clearly see that colors might need some adjustment. So on the left side, you have a dark theme, but it is using the same color of purple that is otherwise used for the light theme. And as you can see, this is now quite overwhelming and doesn't really blend well with the dark tones. So on the right side, you can see an optimized color of purple that works a lot better for that theme. And this might then also impact branding, for example, depending on the colors. So there's quite a few things to figure out when it comes to colors. And another thing to work out are elevations, because different shades and tones create a form of elevation, which means that items kind of visually come to the foreground or go to the background. And we already saw that with the cards in the material design example, but also shadows are part of it. And shadows are used a lot in web designs. They can work very well for a light theme, but with a dark background, you might not see any shadows So you'd have to take that into account as well. And next I'd say would be a suitable typeface and font, because white text on a dark background, if done well, could have a more relaxing effect under the right circumstances, but if not done well, can quickly have the opposite effect. Text that is too bold will be too overwhelming. Text that is too thin will also make you strain your eyes more than necessary and just won't be comfortable after some time. So you can decide to have an optimized font for each theme as separate resources, or perhaps have a variable font, which is the fancy way of having only a single font, but you can change the font weight or thickness just with CSS properties. And the final example is about images, because images do stand out a little more on a dark background. So if possible, you want to tone down your images slightly on a dark layout. So one way is to adjust them with CSS to tone them down a little. But the problem with blanket rules like this is they might not work for all cases. So some images might still be a little too bright and some images might become a little too dark. So a better solution is to actually load different images for each theme, which could look like this example. And it will allow us to optimize the images, but not just in brightness, but also in other ways, such as colors, for example. Maybe you have a logo with that bright purple color that we saw in the material design example, then you probably want to adjust that specific color for the dark theme. And you can also take DuckDuckGo's logo, for example. So the orange would be a little too much for the dark mode. So instead, what they do is they have a simpler, well, let's say outline version of their logo on the dark mode layout. So with some more info on why the themes are important and what we need from design, we can take a look at how we can implement it from a technical point of view. And as usual, these kinds of things, it depends, right, on architecture and project size, for example. But I think the following examples will be generic and will apply to most cases and will at least give you some ideas. And one way to have different themes could be to serve different style sheets. However, a more modern and fitting solution for theming will be to simply use CSS variables. And in case you haven't worked with CSS variables much, this is what they look like. So here we can use variables for the color of our font and background, for example. And at this point, we have no knowledge of what the actual values are. We are simply implementing them. So the values are set elsewhere and we simply inherit. And setting the values can be done using the preferred color scheme media feature that we mentioned, which looks like this. So here on the root selector, which would be the HTML tag for websites, we can set the background color variable to white and make it a dark gray if the user has a dark themed operating system. And by doing this, you have no duplicate style sheets and the colors will end up being whatever is set depending on the user's theme. And on a side note, also tell the browser that you actually support different themes. And you can do that using the color scheme CSS property or with the meta tag in your HTML, whatever you would prefer. And with this information, the browser can help you out by showing a dark background color for your page, for example, as a default, and also style its native elements, such as any text fields and buttons and all of that. Now, you may have a design system and everything might be custom styled, but it is always good to have the browser on your side and help you out wherever it can, even if it's just to get rid of bright background flashes before any asynchronous styles are applied, if you have them. So it would also make sense to have that CSS property part of your critical styles, or just use the meta tag and it will have the same effect. And color scheme is also pretty well supported across Chromium browsers and Safari, most notably. Firefox is lagging behind a little, but most of the time the CSS property will simply do its thing. Detecting the theme is great, and it is definitely better than nothing at all, but ideally users still remain in control. And that means that the user should be able to change the theme if they want to. So the default option could be to detect the user's theme, but allow them to change it for whatever reason. Because maybe they have a practical reason to prefer a different theme at that very moment. For example, they happen to be outside in the sun, and even with brightness all the way up, it is still hard to see properly. So by giving the user choice, we have to store their preference. That could mean saving it to a database or just save it locally to the user's device and let them apply to the current session only. But the choice also introduces a challenge, which is how to deal with the user's preference, because our CSS media features, they will have no knowledge of the user's preference, right? So there's no logic there. The media queries will simply run and act based on what happens to be the user's theme. So we need a way to let the user's preference take priority over the CSS media queries. And that's where we can use some help from JavaScript. And just like with any CSS media feature, we can use match media in JavaScript to run the query, which looks like this example that you see here. And we can then put that in a function and check if the match media matches to see if the user would prefer a dark theme based on their device settings. And then in this example function, we can first retrieve the user's saved preference. And if we have one, we can simply return it. Otherwise, we can then call that match media function to check if the user set a dark operating system. So this way, we can quite easily figure out what kind of theme we are supposed to load for the user. And when we have this knowledge, we could, for example, set a top-level attribute in the HTML. And when we have that attribute, we can properly set global CSS variables like this. So it will be based on the attribute rather than running the CSS media queries here. So the top-level attribute will depend on our logic and pretty much set the theme for us properly. But how can components in your application know about which theme is active? And ideally, they don't have to, but it is possible that it's necessary for some practical reason. Maybe you are going to use the solution to tone down your images with CSS, as we talked about earlier. And depending on the framework and libraries that you use, your components probably cannot detect a top-level attribute because of scoped styles or shadow DOM or whatever form of encapsulation that you're likely using in your project. So the CSS variables, they will still work. They will inherit. That's fine. The theme will be set properly. But the components cannot apply any additional logic beyond that. So how can we solve that? And the simple answer is whatever is convenient. So it's simply a matter of sharing data in your project. So just use the common practice for your stack. And that can be cascading down properties or some state management or simply a shared module. And this could be a simple shared module that your components could use. So first, your application could use the first function to initialize the theme application-wide. And in there, you can put that logic from earlier to detect the user's preference and then the media feature and so forth. And the bottom function could be used exclusively by your features, your components to detect the current theme and use that value for their own styles, for example, as a variable or by setting it as a local attribute. And that's it. So hopefully you have a better understanding of how themes work on the web. And if you're ready to get started, then go explore. Try to start from a design point of view, see what you would need for your application, or just start at implementation and lay down the groundwork for the CSS variables and for switching themes. Also, don't forget to check with your designers. Maybe they already have ideas. And if you talk with them about implementing this, then maybe that's what needed to get the ball rolling and to get started. So let your designers design it. And that is, of course, if you have them. If it's just you in the project, then I guess it's all up to you. In which case I say good luck and have fun. So thanks again for being here. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.